Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Dr. Russell Lowery-Hart, president of Amarillo College. Russell's a product of the Amarillo area. He previously served as a faculty member and associate provost of academic affairs at nearby West Texas A&M University before moving to Amarillo College as vice president of academics. He assumed the college presidency in 2014. Russell isn't your, quote, normal president. He's a game changer. Take, for instance, his tenure at Amarillo. Since assuming the presidency in 2014, he's improved the graduation rate from 19% to over 60% and the persistence rate from 14 up to 88%. He's done this through a series of initiatives targeting students, but these aren't your typical initiatives. They're designed to meet the student where the student is at, not what most universities hope their student is. It's through these type of activities he was named the 2014 recipient of the National Academic Leader of the Year Award by the National Council of Instructional Administrators. Russell, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me back, and thank you for facilitating such important conversations across higher education.
Well, thank you. I just have a lot of fun, and I use this instead of having to study books. I use this to learn from folks. I mean, I'm like yourself, I've been a lifelong learner, and when you get a chance to interact with the quality of people that I get to interact with, if you're not learning, you got to be dead.
Well, you're good at it, and you can tell you enjoy it, and I'm glad you're good at it.
Well, thank you, sir. And speaking of good, you have done incredible things at Amarillo College. I mean, since you took over presidency in 2014, you've improved your graduation rate from 19% to over 60%, persistence from 14 up to 88. What's the secret sauce?
Loving our students. It's not really that much more complicated, Drumm. The foundation to our transformation was getting really clear on who our student is. Talk about her all the time. We call her Maria. Listening to her tell us what she needs from us and then building to that. I think institutions spend millions of dollars trying to train every new crop of student to adapt to us. And I think the source of our transformation has really been allowing our students to tell us what our adaptations need to be and living to that.
Okay. So tell me more about that, about your adaptations. You've got your prototypical student that you call Maria, and we talked about this in our last podcast. How did you come up with Maria?
So I use secret shoppers, and I think we've talked about that, and I use a lot of data to help me understand for the college to understand who our typical student is and what they needed from us. And when we saw the data on who our typical student was, we were a little surprised by it because we thought our non-traditional student existed in the college, but that our traditional student was the majority of our institution. And what we realized is our non-traditional student, the 25-year-old mother of 1.2 kids working 2 part-time jobs, was and had emerged as the traditional student, the average normed student at this college. And the 18-year-old that we had built all our orientations around and our student experiences for was really only 20% of our student population. And that we had to pivot for Maria instead of the student that we thought she was.
So instead of changing your entire recruitment strategy to fit what you wanted to be your prototypical student, you worked your enrollment strategy for who your student actually was.
Yeah,
Now,
and who our community was.
yeah, because you're in the Amarillo area.
Yeah,
It's not the most affluent area in
no,
Texas. And you're reaching out and you're providing education to mostly Hispanic. You're an HSI, Hispanic Serving Institution.
and we're even more since our last conversation, Drum, we become an MSI. The majority of our students are of color at this institution. And the majority of our neighbors are of color in this community. We truly reflect the community in which we serve.
Mm-hmm. And so COVID came along. You were doing all these great things, but your response to COVID, I mean, it blew me away when we spoke. And I was at the TRACS conference this last week, the Transnational Association Christian Colleges and Schools, and I was telling people about. And I used you, I was doing a leadership seminar, and I used you as an example. I hope you don't mind. I just
Love
said,
it.
this guy is, he goes to where the students are. And I talked about how you were taking temperatures for students coming into the computer lab. And of
Yeah.
course, you're masked up. They didn't realize who you were. And I said, this is a servant leader.
Well, and in that, the most fulfilling part of any of our jobs and when we can be of service to other people. And for me, in the middle of the crisis, when there was so much uncertainty, when none of us knew what was real and what wasn't real, and we were all just trying to adapt and scared, we still knew as a college that we had to serve our students. And even though we were going to tech supported learning, and even though we were adapting our services into a mediated environment, our students still needed us in every modality, including in person. And so we just found a way that we could get students logged into a classroom, but it meant they had to come on our campus to do it for some of our students. And I learned so much from them in that process. It changed me, but it was a privilege for me to be in the circle desk, greeting students when they came in, taking their temperature, helping them log in, distributing our food bags, giving out emergency aid. That was a privilege of my lifetime to be of service to our students in a time when they needed it most.
Let's back up a little bit, because passing out bags of emergency aid, food, things like that, you don't typically see a college, a university president doing this unless they're going down to their local soup kitchen, which many of them do.
Right.
You did this as part of AC, Amarillo College.
Yeah, it was a big part of who we are and a part of our transformation before COVID. Like I told you, we use secret shoppers, and I use them to help us reimagine the college. They wrote the values for the college. But one of the things that they told us is it changed me in every sense of the word, because when I asked them to tell me what was keeping them from being successful in the classroom and expecting academic responses, what I got was surprising. It was childcare, healthcare, food, housing, utility payments, transportation, legal services. Those were the things that were affecting their classroom performance. And so if we didn't address those things, it didn't matter how active the learning was or how applied it was or how effective the instruction was, if we couldn't remove those barriers to their learning. So we partnered with the community. We hired social workers. We opened up a robust social service agency connection to our community. And it was the epicenter of our transformation because our students told us it was their biggest barrier.
So what you're telling me is, we all know that COVID exposed a reality that was there before the pandemic. But what you're telling me, it wasn't academic performance that was holding people back. It was life that was causing people to
Yes.
drop out.
The biggest barrier to success in the classroom had nothing to do with the classroom. It was life. And I think we had to honor that and to hear it for what it was. They needed those academic supports. Don't mishear me. They need more engaged in effective pedagogy and curriculum and applied learning. But their biggest barrier to success in the classroom were all of the life barriers that they were tackling outside the classroom. And so if we were truly going to be the transformation that our community needed from us, we had to build a different kind of institution for our students. And once we got clear on who she was and what she needed from us, and then built those things, magic happened. And it wasn't difficult, Drumm. It wasn't like we had to unlock some secret code. We just listened to what our students told us they needed. We found those resources in the community, and we connected to them and connected our students to them, and initially hired a social worker part-time with grant money that's morphed into multiple social workers, a case management system. But it wasn't rocket science. It was, I think, an ability or a will to build ourselves for what the students told us they needed, rather than tell them they were wrong and then try to retrain them to adapt to us.
Mm-hmm. When I think about a change management project, and yours was a huge change management project, you look at really three different things. You look at, obviously you've got your outputs, and your outputs were not good when you first took over. They were not good at all.
No.
But what makes those outcomes is really three things. There's people's mental models, what they think. Then you have structures around those, and then you have processes. So you've got to first change people's mental models. And I think the market research that you did helped to do that. But still, you've got a lot of folks, and it's different from an Ivy League school versus where you are. You've got people who interact more with the community, and your community is much, much different. So the shift from getting someone to think about education versus, okay, how do we help these students meet typical life challenges that they have to where they can be ready? That must have been, a pretty big shift for people to think about.
It was a huge shift. And I like the frame of change management. And so we had to change our own mental model. So our students helped us identify that our model was broken, but we had to go learn what the right structures might look like. So it wasn't just enough to hire a social worker, right? It was an important, but it had to be rooted in learning from organizations outside of higher ed that were serving communities effectively. And some of the seminal things that allowed us to adapt our own mental model is every employee at the college, faculty, staff, went through poverty training. And we have an additional 100 employees that have gone on to be certified poverty coaches with Dr. Donna Beagle. And we did deep data analysis with the Hope Center and Sarah Goldrick-Robb out of Temple that gave us data that codified what our students were saying. 59% of our students were housing insecure and 54% were food insecure. And then we partnered with the Trellis Foundation to understand more in depth what our students' financial health was, and learned that they were an $88 emergency away from dropping out. That allowed us to adapt our mental model to understand who our student was fully, and then build to that student. And I have to say, it was the most fun. And I think most of us in higher education approach change with this fear and acknowledgement that our traditions are so ingrained into our structures that we can't change. And what we've learned at Amarillo College is if you can let go of tradition that's not rooted in research and not rooted in the student experience, you can build new traditions that are, and when you do, magic can happen.
Well, it's like we were talking last week. Higher ed is structured to protect a model that needs to be reimagined.
Yeah, we are, higher ed is a bureaucracy that is by its nature designed to protect itself. And And sometimes organisms protect themselves so that they can ensure their livelihood and their longevity. My fear in higher education is that we are using our bureaucracies to protect a model that is fundamentally broken both in structure and outcomes and finances. But we are doubling down on the model because it's the one that we know, and it's the model that produced us. And so we think it's going to produce more of us. But we, as we experienced our higher education entities, there's fewer of us. And if we're going to be here in 20 and 30 and 50 years and 500 years, we have to adopt and adapt. And yet what I fear is that our bureaucracies are protecting us from those adaptations. And it means that 25 to 50% of us in higher ed will not be here at all in 10 to 20 years.
Well, it reminds me of the systems concept in thermodynamics of entropy, is when you're not taking energy from the outside, when you're self-contained and refuse to look at what's going on the outside, the natural tendency is to die. And that's what we're seeing.
It is. That's such a great metaphor. But what I've noticed in higher education is that not only are we not seeing or embracing what's happening on the outside, we're vilifying it as the reason why we're dying, rather than using it as the epicenter of our transformation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I had someone accuse me of being part of the woke culture this week. And it's like, I can't even spell woke. I don't even know what it means.
I don't know what it means either. I think if loving your students, knowing who they are and loving them is woke, then we all need to be woke. But I'm not sure what woke means on most days.
Exactly. And of course, changing mental models, when you do a survey and like yourself, you find out that 99 of your students are homeless. I mean, that's a wake-up call.
So it's the biggest impact that COVID will have on our own transformation journey moving forward. So when we got CARES money, we already had this robust social services foundation. It was integrated into our training and our hiring. It was integrated into our early alert systems. And then we got, like $10 million of emergency aid. And instead of distributing $250,000 a year, we had 10 million to distribute. And what we had learned with our new mental models is that our students are not monolithic, that their financial needs aren't monolithic, and that if we were truly committed to a culture of caring that loves Maria to success, we had to understand how COVID was affecting her. And so we created an intake model that we borrowed from social service case management systems, and just ask every student to do a self-assessment of what they were dealing with, and use that self-assessment as the basis of how we distributed our CARES funds. So we didn't just do the math model where you take the number of students and divide it by the amount of you have to distribute, because that is inequitable and doesn't honor the crises that some of our students were living in. We used this really quick intake model that we adapted from a school in San Antonio College, Alamo College, adapted it, scaled it for every student. And what we learned, even for us, Drumm, was a kick in the gut. Because the first iteration, where we thought we were deeply connected to our students, and we learned that COVID had created a financial crisis that even we didn't understand. In the first iteration, we identified over 100 students that were homeless as a result of COVID. And then the last iteration of this survey that we just did a week ago, getting ready for the second 8-week term, identified another 99 students that weren't homeless at the beginning of the semester who are now homeless in the middle of the semester. And what we would have done previously, I think, is to take your metaphor of this organism, is we would have seen the loss of students and applied it to an old model that The students started the semester, they couldn't cut it academically, they weren't prepared, they didn't know how to study, they weren't serious, and blamed them for their departure. Now what we know is that our students were at risk of leaving because they didn't have a place to live. And we could activate our partnerships in the community and with the city and with our own emergency aides to connect them to homes. And that's what we did. We wouldn't have done that as intentionally or known how broad the crisis were if COVID hadn't challenged us to create a new system.
So you changed your mental models. You put faculty, you put everybody through poverty training. You changed structures. You already had the social worker in place, but you created this new intake questionnaire so you had a better sense. And then because you'd already changed that, you changed the terms. You used to be semesters, and now you're 8-week terms.
8 weeks, yeah.
There's a lot of other things, structural things that you changed, and those structural change led to process changes.
Huge, yeah. So really what we learned from Maria is what she told us she needed to be successful, we took and made it our theory of change. We can remove a life barrier, and that's our social services structures, in an accelerated learning environment, which is 8 weeks. It's required tutoring, and it is no developmental education at all. And in a culture of caring where Maria feels loved, then she'll complete. That is the theory of change that our students defined for us. And the reason they told us why they needed social services, but we were surprised of why they needed accelerated learning environments. Our data showed us that we were losing the majority of our students in weeks 10, 11, and 12. They were dropping out to take out an extra shift. They were dropping out because the grandmother in their apartment complex got sick and couldn't take care of kids, and they had to take on extra shifts to pay for childcare or couldn't find childcare at all. Whatever the barrier, the shorter her time to degree, the more likely she was to finish it. And that's where the 8 weeks came from. And then really, I think with those other two theories of change, that third element of a culture of caring really became, I think what we learned is that we had a culture where we were penalizing students for being who they were. We had a culture where we penalized students for not understanding our vernacular or our structures or our processes, and we misjudged them as being less intelligent when in fact they're brilliant. They just don't know our processes. And so we had to build a culture of caring where we could love our students through the processes as we were engaging our students to reimagine them.
Well, it's interesting you say this culture of caring, as I'm looking at your banner behind you, an AC, culture of caring. It's an incredible tagline, but it reminds me of a principal that I knew years ago. I was doing an accreditation visit, and he had the opportunity, they'd gotten a large grant from the Gates Foundation to make a 3,000 student comprehensive into smaller schools. And his mantra was, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And that epitomizes what you're doing at AC.
What we were doing, Drumm, and I say we collectively in higher education, is that we were building these processes and automating them and using technology, but we had removed ourselves from it. And what our students told us is they needed us before they could engage the processes. They needed to know that we saw them and that we cared for them and that we were willing to help them if the processes were overwhelming. And so they wrote our values. They defined what the culture of caring looked and felt like for them. We hire for it. We evaluate for it. And I think it's ultimately the foundation of our success that makes the social services in the 8 weeks work, because there is this foundation that our number one job for any employee is love students to success.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's interesting because some of the naysayers and all this, say you're passing out this money. Fraud should be a huge issue, but you find out it's absolutely not, is it?
It's not. What we learned from Donna Beagle is that, especially when it comes to issues of poverty, is that the stereotypes of it are debilitating. And most people think you're living in poverty because you aren't willing to work. And the reality of poverty is that people are working 2 and 3 part-time jobs. The issue isn't laziness. The issue is that their jobs aren't paying them a living wage. So she says that we build these bureaucracies because we're so afraid someone with nothing might get something they don't deserve that we end up penalizing 98% of the people that just need a little help. So instead of approaching these relationships from a distrust, where we're assuming every student is trying to game the system, we approach it from a place of trust and then allow students to identify if we need to, on the back end, engage in issues of fraud. So, for example, if a student is coming back and needing a second or a third emergency aid, it usually signifies a deeper issue, so we case manage them. Even in the case management process, where we get to know students really specifically, in the 7 years we've been doing this, we've not found maybe 1 or 2 students that were gaming the system, but I wouldn't even classify them as fraud. There isn't fraud in the system in wholesale ways that I think our politicians want us to believe. People want to be successful. They want us to help them be successful, and we don't have to police that. In fact, we spend way too much money trying to police it. And if we could take the money we spend in policing the paperwork around issues of social services, we could have even greater impact. The fraud just isn't there. It's not a part of the reality. And we have seen that firsthand at Amarillo College, that when you can walk in trust, build your systems around that with checks and balances on the back end rather than the front end, then students they'll honor your trust in them. I can't tell you, Drumm, how many students that get a little emergency aid or get a bag of food, how many of them come back and donate even more money back or more food once they're through their crisis. They're pretty magical, and the misnomer that they're takers just doesn't match the lived experience we've had with them.
Yeah. Well, it's the key is trust. And
Yeah.
what I've typically found is people who do not trust others, it's because they don't trust themselves.
It's such a really powerful insight. And there was something else that we had to understand about our own bureaucracy and distrust. And forgive me if I curse a little bit in this process.
Oh,
but we had to get over our own selves that providing these wraparound supports doesn't mean that we're lowering rigor. It's actually meant that we've been able to increase rigor and deepen learning and broaden it. And we had to confront this really ugly truth in higher education, where we have somehow equated being an asshole with being rigorous. Being an ass does not make you rigorous or effective. It just makes you an ass.
It just makes you an ass.
It just makes you an ass. But providing support and love is not lowering your standards. It really gives you a foundation to raise them.
It really does. And now you're also a member of Rep 4.
Yes.
The Rapid Education Prototyping for Changed Learners, Community, and Equity. And are you exporting what you're doing at Amarillo to those other 5 schools?
So we just came back from a Rep 4 convening in Grand Valley State in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And it was thrilling to be with 5 other innovative institutions, really having this conversation. Who are our communities? Who are our students? And how can we adapt to them? We were honored to share our story, honored to learn from other people's stories. And I think what gives me hope is that there is an acknowledgement that the existing systems and bureaucracies are broken, and we have to build rapid response to those shifts. And the center of it for all of Rep 4 is the student voice, which I take great pride in because it's been the foundation of AC's transformation as well. So we spent 2 days together hearing students, hearing from each other, challenging the structures that we think are broken and reimagining how technology can help us change the landscape of learning. And I have great hope for it.
Well, we're going to have to get you and Philly back on the podcast in a couple of months after the dust has settled from the meeting.
I would be honored. Philly is a transformational leader. She's the president at Grand Valley State and the presidents of Boise State and Shippensburg and Fort Hays State and San Jose State. Just incredible leaders in a sector of higher education where they're very well respected, but they're not the Ivy Leagues that I think are resistant to the very changes that are going to be demanded of us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there is a place for the Ivies.
There is
absolutely
an important place, but I think that we have overinflated that place to feel like that every institution should aspire to that place. And ultimately, I think every institution needs to aspire to what their communities and their regions and their states demand of them.
Especially when you take a look at demographics now, and the vast majority of students are attending whether it's online or hybrid or face-to-face, their institution is within 50 miles of where they live.
It is. And the misnomer is that this issue of poverty and Maria is a community college specific issue. Maria is the typical student for all of our communities across the country, even if she's not the typical student at our premier universities. But if you look at our communities, we're more alike than we are different, and we're alike in ways that worry me. Poverty is growing as a significant barrier in communities across our country. Instead of adapting to the diversification of our country, we seem to demonize it and fear it. And higher education should be the epicenter of leading our communities to embrace it and understand it.
I agree. And let's go to our usual, 3 takeaways. And I'm going to break the mental model here. And I'm going to start off with one. I think each institution needs to define who their Maria is.
Can I add to that?
Oh, absolutely.
They need to define who their Maria is currently at their institution, but they also have to define who their Maria is in their community that they're not serving. Because for a lot of institutions, especially universities, the student they're recruiting is not the student that lives in and supports the community in which they reside.
Great. That's number one. What are the other 2 takeaways?
That once you identify the Maria, you have to empower her by telling you how to rebuild yourself for her.
So we need to change for our outside environment. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, what a concept.
What a concept, right? Instead of demanding the outside environment adapt themselves to us, we have to adapt if we're going to be relevant and exist.
Mm-hmm. And the third?
Is that once you identify your Maria and you build for her, you have to build structures of love for her. And we use the word love very intentionally at Amarillo College because it signifies how personal this work has to be for our students. That if the work is devoid of the relational advocacy, it doesn't matter how great the structures are that we're building on our behalf. Relationship, connection, the personalization of the experience is that third element of transformation that I think makes the other 2 shifts in the mental model work.
People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Great. Well, Russell, what's next for you? What's next for Amarillo? Besides moving into your new office or your old office.
So we're moving into a new strategic plan that builds on this culture of caring, but understands that we've got to integrate learning in real applied ways and integrate the workplace into that learning, integrate employers into that learning, and truly embrace a skill economy that might make some of our degrees obsolete because students don't need 2, 4, and 6 years. They might just need 2 weeks, 4 weeks, or 6 months. And that is the next shift for us. How do we build an earn and learn model where students can earn a living while they're learning with us? And that classroom might not be on a campus. It might be in a workplace or in the community.
Mm-hmm. Well, very good. Russell, it's always a pleasure to talk with you, my friend.
My joyful, as always, Drumm. Thank you. Thank you for your voice and your partnership and your friendship.
Likewise, my friend. Take care. Thanks for listening, and a special thank you to this week's special guest, Dr. Russell Lowery-Hart, president of Amarillo College, and for his sharing with us how to create an environment that enables underrepresented students overcome barriers to their success. Our next guest is Dr. Mark Lombardi, president of Maryville University. Mark is a change agent, and in the 15 years he's been at the helm of Maryville, they've tripled enrollment, had multi-million-dollar surpluses in 12 straight years, and pivoted to online education, where they have improved their reach to 50 states and 56 countries. Join us for this podcast to find out the secrets behind why the Chronicle of Higher Education named Maryville the second fastest growing private university in the nation in 2020, and in 2013 and 14 named Maryville the number 1 overperforming university in the United States.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.